What's up guys, welcome back to another MOTOBOB video. Now the stock suspension on my Triumph Street Twin was fine, but a little bit soft and mushy, and so I wanted to upgrade it. But I don't have the kind of money you need for Öhlins or Fox, so I chose one of the cheaper options. These Hagon shocks cost me 139 quid for the pair, and you can get them as fully adjustable gas shocks for I think just under £200. I personally just need preload adjustment for when I'm carrying a pillion, so that's why I went for the cheaper model. And the progressive fork springs and oil cost just under £100. Now I think you can save yourself about 10 or 15 quid if you just buy the springs alone. But Hagon recommends a different viscosity of oil than the stock oil, so it's worth picking it up at the same time. So you can pretty much overhaul the whole suspension of the bike for just 250 quid, which is less than half of a big brand pair of rear shocks. But we need to get them on the bike to find out whether they're any good. Installing the rear shocks is pretty simple, only complicated slightly on my bike by the fact that you have to remove the silencer on each side to access the lower shock bolt. Once you've got access, you just remove both of the bolts, pull the shock off the bike, leaving the other shock in place to support the rear end. You can then lift the rear of the bike and push the new shock into place. If you're struggling to lift the bike, you might find it easier to use a jack just in front of the swing arm to lift the rear, decompress the shocks, and make it easier to slide them into place. Either way, you might struggle to get them fully onto the bosses, but tightening up the bolts will of course push them and slide them into place onto their mounts. I used Motone's shock dress-up bolts for a neater appearance and applied a little bit of thread locker before putting them in. Of course, I'd recommend using the torque wrench for this job to torque the bolts to the spec found in the Haynes manual and ensure that they're not too loose, but also not so tight that they're restricting movement. At this stage, I also removed the Hagon stickers from around the preload adjuster there, just because they're quite a silvery, shiny foil and it didn't quite suit the overall look of my bike. Replace the silencer and repeat on the other side. The fork springs, however, are an altogether more complicated procedure. Start by loosening any major bolts like the wheel pinch bolt and axle and the fork caps so that you're not heaving on them while the bike is precariously balanced on the jack. You can then jack the bike however you like. On my bike there's a couple of mounting points for a bash guard which I don't have fitted, but they're ideal for lifting the bike, and I use a little bit of anti-slip mat on the jack so that the bike won't slide off. You can then start dismantling the front end, so off comes the mudguard, brake caliper, ABS sensor, the front wheel and the mudguard mount. Note that I've supported the brake caliper on a toolbox so that the weight isn't pulling down on the brake lines and connections. Once you've removed everything from the bottom of the forks, you can start to loosen the yoke clamps and any headlight or speedo brackets. And once everything's sufficiently loosened off, you can then remove the forks. Once they're off the bike, you can remove the fork caps. Pull out the spacer and then tip out the spring and washer, retaining the washer. You then need to pump out the fork oil, getting as much as possible out before you leave it upside down for the rest to drain out. This might take about 30 or 40 minutes, so go and make yourself a cup of tea while they drain out. Once they're done, pour some of the new oil into the fork and give it a good 20 or 30 pumps to make sure the oil has worked its way through the fork innards. You can hear the air escaping while you're pumping it, and you won't hear that noise so much once it's filled up. After that, with the fork fully compressed, you need to top up the oil and then use a fork oil gauge like this one that I bought for a few quid on eBay to draw out some of the oil and leave the specified air gap. The air gap is usually printed on the end of the box for the fork springs. Once that's done, you can drop the new spring in with the tighter coils at the top. then the washer and make sure it's settled, then the spacer, and then the fork cap goes into place. And of course, like all the other bolts, you need to torque that back up to spec. With both forks done, you can reassemble the front end, which is basically the same process in reverse, but taking care to torque everything, especially the fork clamps. So as I said, I told you that was a little bit more complicated, but was it worth it? I mean, before the upgrade, the bike was, as I said, pretty squishy and soft. So that would mean that in my experience, it would tend to run a little bit wide on corners, and even around town, I would notice that on things like roundabouts. It was also so squishy that when you had a passenger on board, even with the highest preload setting, it felt like the steering was very light and it made the front end of the bike feel like it was up in the air. The Hagon suspension is certainly a little bit harsher, although it might become a little bit more supple after it breaks in after a few hundred miles, but the bike steers infinitely better. It holds its line better around corners without a doubt, and there's way less sag when you sit on the bike. The fork springs absolutely definitely reduce the amount of dive when you're braking. That's something I noticed straight away on the bike. And I've actually found as well that there's less wallowing back and forth if you're on and off the throttle in and around town in the lower gears. Some riders might prefer that squishy comfort of the stock suspension, but for me, this is a great upgrade. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, if you've got questions about these Hagon shocks and fitting them, let me know in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video.